The hills of northeastern France hold secrets in their soil. Beneath the forests and the quiet meadows lie the echoes of a battle so immense that the earth itself was forever changed. In 1916, two great armies collided here in a struggle that would last 300 days. They fought for ground that seemed worthless, yet both sides believed they were fighting for survival itself. This is the story of Verdun, a battle that became a symbol, a wound that never fully healed, and a testament to the limits of human endurance. By the end of 1915, the Great War had reached a terrible stalemate. From the Swiss border to the English Channel, a continuous line of trenches scarred the earth. Millions of men lived in these muddy corridors, emerging only to attack and be slaughtered, gaining a few hundred yards at most before being pushed back again. The war that everyone had promised would end by Christmas of 1914 showed no signs of ending at all. Both sides had suffered catastrophic losses. France had already lost nearly 1 million men. Germany had lost even more. Yet neither could find the key to breaking through the other's defenses. The Western Front had become a locked door, and every attempt to force it open had ended in disaster. In Germany, the military high command wrestled with this problem through the autumn months. The man charged with finding a solution was Erich von Falkenhayn, chief of the German General Staff. Falkenhayn was a cold and calculating strategist, a man who thought in terms of mathematics and attrition rather than glory and decisive victory. He understood that Germany could not win a prolonged war of exhaustion. The British naval blockade was slowly strangling his nation, cutting off food and supplies from overseas. German civilians were already beginning to feel the pinch of hunger. Something had to change, and it had to change soon. Falkenhayn's solution was as brutal as it was logical. Rather than seeking a breakthrough that might never come, he would force France to bleed itself to death, defending ground it could not afford to lose. He would choose a target so precious to French national pride that they would throw every soldier they had into its defense. And there, in a battle of attrition fought on his terms, German artillery superiority would grind the French army into dust. The target he chose was Verdun. The ancient fortress city sat on the Meuse River in the Lorraine region of northeastern France. It was not particularly valuable in military terms. The front lines had long since moved beyond it, and it no longer served as a vital strategic position. But Verdun carried something far more powerful than strategic worth. It carried the weight of history. For centuries, Verdun had stood as a symbol of French resistance against Germanic invasion. When the Prussians had swept through France in 1870, humiliating the nation and seizing Alsace and Lorraine, Verdun had been the last fortress to fall. The shame of that defeat still burned in French memory. To lose Verdun again would be unthinkable. Falkenhayn was counting on exactly this. He believed that France would sacrifice its entire army rather than surrender those sacred hills. The plan was given a code name, Operation Gericht. The word meant judgment in German, and there was a grim appropriateness to it. This would be a trial by fire, and France would be the defendant. Falkenhayn assembled the largest concentration of artillery the world had ever seen. 1,200 guns were gathered in secret, hidden in forests and ravines along the German lines. Ammunition trains rolled eastward night after night, stockpiling millions of shells. The bombardment he planned would be unprecedented in scale, a hurricane of steel and fire that would obliterate the French defenses before the infantry even advanced. Command of the assault was given to Crown Prince Wilhelm, the Kaiser's eldest son. The young prince was eager to prove himself, to win glory for his family and his empire. He established his headquarters in the forests north of Verdun and welcomed his father's visit in the weeks before the attack. Photographs from that time show the Crown Prince in his distinctive uniform, a death's head emblem gleaming on his cap, encouraging his officers with promises of victory. "His Majesty calls us to the attack," he told them. "We must show that the will to victory of the sons of Germany is as hard as steel." In the final days before the assault, Thousands of German soldiers converged on the staging areas. They marched through frozen forests and huddled in villages requisitioned for the offensive. Engineers had carved an elaborate network of tunnels beneath the hills. Underground chambers called Stollen, where entire battalions could shelter from French artillery and await the order to advance. In one of these subterranean warrens, a 20-year-old soldier named Clement Birkenhoff waited with his comrades. "By the door I have my rifle and 3,000 cartridges," he wrote to his family. That should put the French on the run. Like so many others, he believed the battle would be swift and decisive. He had no way of knowing that he was about to enter a nightmare that would consume an entire year. And what of the French? They sat in their fortresses and trenches, remarkably unaware of what was coming. The commander of all French forces, General Joseph Joffre, had convinced himself that Verdun was too strong to attack. The ring of forts surrounding the city, some 30 fortifications built into the hills, represented the finest military engineering of the age. These were not simple earthworks but massive concrete structures, their walls thick enough to resist the heaviest shells, their interiors equipped with retractable gun turrets and underground barracks. Names like Douaumont, Vaux, Souville, and Tavannes would soon be seared into the memory of the world. But in February of 1916, they seemed to promise nothing but safety. So confident was Joffre in these defenses that he had begun stripping the forts of their heavy guns. The cannons were needed elsewhere, he reasoned, for the great offensive he was planning with the British along the Somme River to the north. The forts could manage with skeleton garrisons. Some were left almost entirely unmanned. This decision would soon prove catastrophic, but in the comfortable offices of the French High Command, no one questioned it. The soldiers themselves shared this false confidence. On the 19th of February, just 2 days before the German bombardment would begin, a soldier named de Bloch wrote home from the mighty fortress of Douaumont. "Everyone here reckons the war will be over by March," he said. "That is next month." Yet there was one man who saw the truth. Lieutenant Colonel Émile Drian was a career officer and local politician from the Lorraine region. He was also something of a prophet, a military thinker who had written books attempting to forecast the future of warfare. From his command post in the Bois des Cours, a forest on the front lines 10 kilometers north of Douaumont, Drian had watched the German preparations with growing alarm. He could see the supply columns moving through the distant woods. He could hear the rumble of trains bringing men and material to the front. For months he had sent warnings to Paris, pleading with the High Command to reinforce the sector. "The German assault will happen," he wrote, "and they can get through." His warnings were ignored. The generals in Paris knew better than a mere lieutenant colonel. Verdun was impregnable, everyone said so. And so the days of February slipped past, each one bringing the storm closer. In the German tunnels, soldiers checked their rifles and whispered prayers. In the French trenches, men wrote letters home and dreamed of the war ending soon. Neither side could truly imagine what was about to begin. The judgment was coming, and no one would be spared. The morning of February 21st, 1916, began in frozen silence. A pale winter light crept across the hills east of the Meuse River, illuminating a landscape that still bore the scars of earlier fighting. In the French trenches, soldiers stamped their feet against the cold and waited for another unremarkable day. Some brewed coffee over small fires. Others wrote letters or simply stared at the gray sky. They had no way of knowing that in a few hours their world would be utterly transformed. At 7:15 in the morning, the silence shattered. 1,200 German guns opened fire simultaneously along a front stretching 8 miles wide. The sound was beyond anything human ears had ever experienced. It was not the crack of individual shells, but a continuous roar. A wall of noise so overwhelming that men miles from the front felt the earth trembling beneath their feet. French pilots flying reconnaissance missions above the battlefield looked down and saw something they would never forget. The German artillery positions formed a blazing yellow line across the landscape, thousands of muzzle flashes merging into a single ribbon of fire. What followed was the heaviest bombardment in military history up to that point. The Germans had invented a new term for this kind of shelling. They called it Trommelfeuer, drum fire, because the explosions came so fast and so continuously that they sounded like the rolling of an enormous drum. 1 million shells fell on the French positions that first day alone. The earth erupted in fountains of dirt and stone. Trenches that had taken months to dig were erased in minutes. Concrete bunkers cracked and collapsed. Trees were reduced to splinters, and the splinters were reduced to dust. In the Bois de Corps, Lieutenant Colonel Driant and his men experienced the full fury of this onslaught. His 2 battalions of chasseurs, light infantry soldiers known for their skill and tenacity, numbered only about 400 men. They faced a German force of over 1,300. Before the infantry assault even began, the bombardment had already done terrible damage. Men were buried alive in collapsed dugouts. Others were thrown through the air by the concussive force of the explosions. Those who survived crouched in whatever shelter they could find, their eyes wide with shock, their ears bleeding from the pressure. "We were deafened," one survivor would later recall. Eyes bugging out, blown upside down. The shells fell without pause, without mercy. There was no pattern to predict, no safe corner to hide. Men simply endured and prayed, knowing that at any moment the next shell might find them. The psychological toll was as devastating as the physical destruction. Some soldiers lost their minds entirely, screaming or laughing or simply staring into nothing. Others retreated into a kind of numb acceptance, moving mechanically through a world that had become pure chaos. At 4 o'clock in the afternoon, the bombardment lifted. For a brief moment, an eerie quiet settled over the shattered landscape. Then the whistles blew, and more than 30,000 German infantry rose from their trenches and advanced. They moved forward in waves, their gray uniforms blending with the smoke and dust that hung over everything. Many expected to find nothing but corpses ahead of them. The bombardment had been so intense, so thorough, that surely nothing could have survived. But the French were still there. Bloodied, dazed, reduced to a fraction of their original numbers, they emerged from the rubble and began to fight. In the Bois de Corps, Driant rallied his surviving chasseurs. They were outnumbered nearly 5 to 1, defending positions that had been reduced to craters and fallen logs. Yet they held their ground with a ferocity that stunned the attackers. The Germans had expected a walkover. Instead, they found themselves in a desperate close-quarters battle, fighting for every yard of blasted forest. Driant was everywhere that day, moving from position to position, encouraging his men, directing their fire. He knew the situation was hopeless. Reinforcements were not coming. Ammunition was running low. The German numbers were simply too great. But he refused to abandon his post. In the late afternoon, while attempting to rescue a wounded soldier, a bullet struck him in the head. He fell among his men, one of the first of hundreds of thousands who would die on these hills. His body was later recovered by the Germans, who buried him with military honors. Even the enemy recognized his courage. By nightfall of that first day, the German advance had pushed deep into the French lines. Village after village fell to the attackers. The carefully prepared defenses were crumbling faster than anyone in Paris had imagined possible. French officers sent increasingly desperate reports to the rear. "It is like the end of the world," one lieutenant wrote. "Both officers and their men are beginning to lose hope. We just have to save face before it all goes to hell." The tone of these messages revealed the depth of the crisis. This was not an orderly retreat. It was a catastrophe unfolding in real time. The Germans pressed their advantage over the following days. On February 22nd and 23rd, they continued their advance, capturing key positions and taking thousands of prisoners. The French command structure began to fracture under the pressure. Orders were issued and countermanded. Reinforcements were promised but did not arrive. The soldiers at the front felt abandoned, sacrificed to buy time for decisions that never came. And still, the German artillery thundered, never allowing the defenders a moment to regroup or breathe. Then came the 25th of February. and with it a blow that shook France to its core. Fort Douaumont, the largest and supposedly strongest of all the Verdun fortresses, fell to the Germans. The circumstances of its capture would become a source of shame and controversy for years to come. This massive structure, with walls of concrete and stone thick enough to resist the heaviest shells, with its underground barracks and retractable gun turrets, had been designed to withstand any assault. It was the crown jewel of the Verdun defenses, a symbol of French military engineering, and it was taken by a handful of German soldiers walking through the front door. The story of Douaumont's fall reads almost like a dark comedy. In the chaos of the preceding days, a French general had ordered the fort's garrison withdrawn, leaving only a skeleton crew of maintenance workers inside. The decision was meant to be temporary, but in the fog of battle, no one thought to send the soldiers back. When a small group of Brandenburg infantry, acting without orders from their commanders, decided to probe the fortress's defenses, they discovered to their amazement that it was virtually unguarded. Captain Haupt led his men through the barbed wire and across the moat, half expecting to be cut down at any moment. Instead, they found silence. The greatest danger they faced was friendly fire. The German artillery had not been informed of this unauthorized assault and continued to shell the approaches to the fort. Captain Haupt and his men advanced through a rain of their own side's explosives, reaching the main entrance more by luck than design. Once inside, they encountered only a few bewildered French technicians who surrendered without resistance. Just like that, the mightiest fortress in France had changed hands. The date was February 25th, only 4 days after the battle had begun. When news of Douaumont's capture reached Germany, the church bells rang from one end of the empire to the other. It seemed like a sign of imminent victory, proof that the French defenses were collapsing. A young mother in Freiburg wrote to her husband at the front, expressing the jubilation of the nation. "What a joy to read this news," she said. "May God grant us peace, and let the music of the cannons hail our future happiness." The German press hailed the Crown Prince as a conquering hero. Postcards were printed showing the fortress draped in German flags. It was the greatest symbolic victory of the war so far. In France, the reaction was one of shock and despair. The fall of Douaumont struck at something deep in the national psyche. It awakened memories of 1870, of the humiliating defeat at the hands of Prussia, of the long years of shame that followed. If Verdun falls, people whispered, France falls too. The image of German soldiers planting their flag atop that sacred fortress was almost too painful to bear. Politicians demanded answers. Generals pointed fingers at one another. The entire French military establishment seemed paralyzed by the speed and scale of the disaster. In Paris, the politicians convened an emergency session. General Joffre, who had so confidently assured everyone that Verdun could not be attacked, now found himself facing the fury of the government. Prime Minister Aristide Briand delivered an ultimatum that left no room for misunderstanding. "If you evacuate Verdun and sound the retreat," he told the general, "you will be dismissed immediately, along with all your chiefs of staff. There would be no strategic withdrawal, no trading of space for time. Verdun would be held at any cost." The order that went out to the troops that night was stark in its simplicity. You are to fight to the death while awaiting reinforcements. Among the prisoners taken by the Germans in those early days was a young captain named Charles de Gaulle. He was 25 years old, an ambitious officer who had already been wounded twice in the war. Near the ruins of Douaumont, his unit was overrun by the German advance. De Gaulle took a bayonet wound to the thigh and was left for dead on the battlefield. When the Germans found him still breathing, they carried him to a field hospital and then to a prisoner of war camp. He would spend the rest of the war in captivity, making 5 unsuccessful escape attempts. No one could have guessed that this obscure young captain would one day lead France through an even darker hour, or that his name would become synonymous with French resistance and national pride. As February drew to a close, the situation at Verdun remained desperate. The Germans had advanced nearly 10 kilometers in less than a week. They held Douaumont and were pressing toward the remaining forts. The French lines were in disarray, the defenders exhausted and demoralized. Yet the very speed of the German success had created its own problems. Their supply lines were stretched thin. Their troops were tired from continuous fighting. And the French, despite everything, had not broken. They were battered, yes, they were bleeding, but they were still fighting. The stage was set for a new phase of the battle, one that would transform Verdun from a crisis into a legend. In the darkest moments of crisis, history sometimes produces the right person at the right time. For France, in late February of 1916, that person was Philippe Pétain. He was 60 years old, a career soldier who had spent most of his life in obscurity. Unlike the flamboyant generals who dominated the French high command, Pétain was reserved, methodical, and deeply skeptical of the offensive doctrines that had led to so many disasters. He believed in firepower over elan, in preparation over reckless courage. Before the war, these views had kept him from advancement. Now they would make him the savior of Verdun. Pétain received his orders on the night of February 25th, the same day that Douaumont had fallen. He was to take command of the defense of Verdun immediately. There was no time for elaborate planning or careful preparation. The situation was deteriorating by the hour. Pétain drove through the night toward his new headquarters in the town hall of Souilly, a small village south of the battlefield. The roads were clogged with retreating soldiers, wounded men, and refugees fleeing the advancing Germans. It was a scene of chaos and despair, the visible evidence of an army on the verge of collapse. When Pétain arrived at Souilly in the early hours of February 26th, he found a command structure in disarray. Staff officers ran from room to room with contradictory reports. Telephone lines to the front were cut or jammed with panicked messages. No one seemed to know exactly where the Germans were or how far they had advanced. Pétain absorbed all of this with his characteristic calm. He asked questions, studied maps, and began to impose order on the confusion. By morning, he had a clear picture of the situation and a plan to address it. The hemorrhaging would stop. Verdun would hold. His first priority was the artillery. Pétain understood that in modern warfare, guns were more important than men. The German advantage in artillery had made their initial breakthrough possible. To stop them, the French needed to match that firepower and exceed it. He ordered every available cannon rushed to the sector. Batteries were positioned on the west bank of the Meuse River, where they could fire into the flanks of any German advance. The heights of the left bank, hills with names like Côte 304 and Le Morhan, became anchors of the defense. From these positions, French guns could rain shells on the attackers and break up their assaults before they reached the trenches. But guns were useless without ammunition, and ammunition was useless without a way to deliver it. This was the logistical nightmare that Pétain now confronted. The German advance had left Verdun connected to the rest of France by only a single road and one narrow-gauge railway line. This stood in stark contrast to the German side, where 14 major rail lines fed men and supplies to the front. If that one French road was cut or became impassable, the battle would be lost. Everything depended on keeping it open. Pétain threw himself into solving this problem with an intensity that bordered on obsession. The road ran from Bar-le-Duc to Verdun, roughly 50 miles of rutted, muddy track that had never been designed for heavy military traffic. Pétain demanded that it be transformed into a lifeline. He ordered thousands of territorial soldiers, men too old for frontline combat, to work on the road around the clock. They spread gravel, filled potholes, and drained the worst of the mud. They worked in shifts, day and night, often under artillery fire. Whenever a section of road began to crumble under the weight of the trucks, they were there to repair it before traffic could be disrupted. And the trucks rolled without ceasing. Pétain established a system of one-way traffic, with vehicles traveling bumper to bumper in continuous columns. No truck was allowed to stop for any reason. If a vehicle broke down, it was pushed off the road immediately to clear the way for those behind it. The pace was relentless, almost inhuman. 6,000 vehicles passed along the road every day. They carried men, ammunition, food, medical supplies, and everything else needed to keep an army fighting. By the time the battle ended, 3 million men and 2 million tons of material would travel this route. The soldiers gave it a name. They called it La Voie Sacrée, the Sacred Way. The title captured something of the religious fervor that had come to surround the defense of Verdun. This was no longer simply a military operation. It had become a crusade, a test of national will. The road itself became a symbol of French determination, proof that the nation could organize itself for total war. Every truck that reached the front was a small victory. Every shell delivered was a message to the Germans that France would not break. Among the men traveling that road in the early days of March was a young lawyer serving as a lieutenant. His name was Joubert, and he kept a diary of his experiences. "The very blood of France is here," he wrote, as his unit made its way toward the sound of the guns. He was not speaking metaphorically. The cream of French manhood was being funneled along this single artery, poured into the furnace of Verdun. Over the next 10 months, fully 2/3 of the entire French army would pass through this corridor. 2.5 million men would make the journey that Joubert was now making. Many of their names would later be inscribed on the monuments to the dead. As the reinforcements arrived and the guns were positioned, the French defense began to stiffen. The Germans continued to attack, but their advances grew smaller and more costly. Every yard of ground they gained was paid for in blood. The element of surprise was gone. The French knew they were fighting for survival, and they fought with a desperate ferocity that surprised even themselves. In the trenches and shell holes around Verdun, a simple phrase began to circulate among the soldiers. "Ils ne passeront pas," they shall not pass. These words would become the rallying cry of the entire battle, a declaration of defiance that captured the spirit of the defense. Pétain himself embodied this spirit of determined resistance. He made regular visits to the front lines, exposing himself to the same dangers as his men. He listened to their complaints and addressed their concerns. He made sure they were fed, supplied, and rotated out of the worst positions before they broke completely. Unlike many generals of his era, Pétain genuinely cared about the welfare of his soldiers. He knew that men could only endure so much, and he structured his defense accordingly. This humanity would later make him beloved by the common soldiers of France, even as it frustrated his superiors who wanted more aggressive action. His most famous words were spoken in these early days of the defense. "Courage," he told his men. "On this hora, we will get them." The phrase was simple, almost banal. But in the context of those desperate hours, it carried enormous weight. It was a promise that the sacrifice would not be in vain, that France would not only survive but prevail. The words spread through the army like wildfire. They were repeated in letters home, printed in newspapers, shouted by soldiers going into battle. Pétain had given the nation something it desperately needed: hope. But while the French were consolidating their defense, the Germans were facing a difficult realization. The quick victory they had expected was not coming. The first 2 weeks of the offensive had produced spectacular gains, but those gains had come at a terrible cost. German casualties were mounting far faster than anticipated. The French artillery on the west bank of the Meuse was proving devastatingly effective, tearing into German assault columns before they could even reach the French lines. Something would have to be done about those guns. For the German soldiers in the trenches, the reality of the battle was far grimmer than the triumphant headlines at home suggested. The young men who had marched so confidently toward Verdun were discovering the true nature of modern war. Many of them were barely 18 years old, conscripts who had been told they were defending the fatherland. Now they found themselves in a landscape that resembled nothing so much as the surface of the moon. The constant shelling had churned the earth into a sea of mud and craters. Trees had been reduced to blackened stumps. The air smelled of cordite and decay. In the underground tunnels beneath Fort Douaumont, now in German hands, a young soldier named Siegfried ILM wrote to his parents. "I am besieged by terrible thoughts," he confessed. "My gaiters are covered in blood. We just listen to the ceiling dripping. My armpits are itching. It is lice, for heaven's sake." The contrast between his words and the celebratory tone of the German newspapers could not have been starker. These were not conquering heroes savoring victory. They were exhausted boys, far from home, trying to survive a nightmare. Among the casualties of these early weeks was one of Germany's greatest painters. Franz Marc was a visionary artist, a founder of the Expressionist movement, whose vibrant canvases of blue horses and abstract landscapes had made him famous throughout Europe. He had volunteered for the army in 1914, swept up in the enthusiasm that gripped so many young men. By 1916, that enthusiasm had long since died. In a letter to his wife written shortly before his death, Marc described what he saw around him. "All I see," he wrote, "is the most frightful spectacle the human brain could ever imagine." A few days later, a French shell ended his life. He was 36 years old. The Crown Prince and his father, the Kaiser, could not ignore the mounting difficulties. In the first 2 weeks of the offensive, the Germans had advanced 10 kilometers. It had seemed like a triumph at the time. But now the advance had stalled. The French were not breaking. Their artillery was too strong, their reinforcements too numerous. The strategy of bleeding France white was working, but it was bleeding Germany too. Every day that passed without a breakthrough was a day closer to strategic failure. Yet to admit defeat was unthinkable. Too much had been invested, too many promises made. The only option was to press on. The solution, such as it was, required an expansion of the battlefield. The German commanders recognized that they could not take Verdun as long as French artillery dominated from the west bank of the Meuse. Those guns had to be silenced. To reach them, the Germans would have to capture the 2 hills that anchored the French defense on that side of the river. The names of these hills would soon become synonymous with slaughter. The first was called Côte 304, a modest height whose military significance far outweighed its size. The second was known as Le Mort Homme, Dead Man's Hill. The name had nothing to do with the war. It came from a legend about a corpse found on its slopes sometime in the 19th century. But the name would prove tragically prophetic. Every square foot of this hill would be fought over with a violence that defied comprehension. At its summit today stands a monument that captures the horror of what happened there. It is a statue of a skeleton, its bony arm raised in a gesture that might be triumph or despair, crying out a single word: victory. But whose victory, and at what cost? The statue does not say. On March 6th, the Crown Prince launched his forces against Dead Man's Hill. The attack began with another massive bombardment. French soldiers watched in disbelief as the entire hill seemed to explode before their eyes. Earth, stone, and human remains were thrown into the air in enormous fountains of destruction. Then came the infantry, wave after wave of German soldiers climbing the slopes toward the French positions. What followed was a head-on collision, army against army, nation against nation. Neither side could advance. Neither side would retreat. The 2 forces locked together in a death grip that would last for months. And so the Battle of Verdun entered a new phase. The lightning war of the first weeks gave way to a grinding war of attrition. The French had stabilized their lines, thanks to Pétain and the Sacred Way. The Germans had failed to achieve their breakthrough, but they were not yet ready to admit defeat. Both sides were now committed to a struggle that neither could afford to lose. In the trenches and on the hillsides, men prepared themselves for an ordeal that would test the very limits of human endurance. As Pétain had promised, they would not pass. But the price of stopping them would be measured in hundreds of thousands of lives. The spring of 1916 brought no relief to the men fighting at Verdun. While nature awakened across the rest of France, while farmers planted crops and flowers bloomed in village gardens, the hills east of the Meuse remained locked in perpetual winter. The constant bombardment had stripped the landscape of every living thing. Trees that had stood for centuries were reduced to shattered stumps. Grass and undergrowth had been churned into the mud until nothing green remained. The earth itself seemed to have died, poisoned by explosives and soaked with blood. This was the world that soldiers on both sides now inhabited, a world that bore no resemblance to anything they had known before. The battle for Dead Man's Hill consumed the month of March and stretched deep into April. The Germans attacked again and again, throwing fresh divisions against the French positions. Each assault followed the same terrible pattern. First came the bombardment, hours or sometimes days of continuous shelling that reduced trenches to rubble and drove defenders mad with fear. Then came the infantry, climbing over their own dead to reach the enemy lines. Sometimes they succeeded in capturing a few hundred yards. Sometimes they were thrown back with catastrophic losses. And always, within hours or days, the French would counterattack, and the whole bloody cycle would begin again. The hill changed hands so many times that soldiers lost count. A position captured in the morning might be lost by afternoon and retaken by nightfall. Units were fed into the fighting until they ceased to exist as coherent forces. A regiment might arrive at the front with 3,000 men and leave a week later with 300. The survivors were hollow-eyed and trembling, their uniforms caked with mud and worse, their minds scarred by things they could never forget. Yet still, the generals demanded more attacks, more sacrifices, more bodies to feed the insatiable hunger of the battle. By April, the fighting had reached a kind of equilibrium, though equilibrium is too peaceful a word for what was happening. Both armies were dug in along lines that barely moved from week to week. The Germans could not break through to Verdun. The French could not push them back. Each side pounded the other with artillery and launched local attacks that gained nothing but casualty lists. The battle had lost whatever strategic purpose it might once have possessed. It had become pure attrition, a contest to see which nation could endure more suffering before it broke. For the French, this stalemate was actually a kind of victory. Pétain had promised that the Germans would not pass, and they had not. But it was a victory purchased at a price that staggered the imagination. The statistics alone tell part of the story. Over the course of the battle, the two sides would fire more than 60 million artillery shells at each other. That works out to roughly 1 ton of explosives for every square yard of the battlefield. The bombardment never stopped, not for an hour, not for a minute. Day and night, the guns roared. Soldiers learned to distinguish between the different calibers by sound alone. The whine of a 77mm field gun, the deeper boom of a 155, the terrifying shriek of the heavy mortars that could bury a dugout and everyone in it. They learned which sounds meant danger and which could be ignored, though in truth, nothing could really be ignored. Death could come from any direction at any moment. The physical landscape became something out of a nightmare. Shell craters overlapped with shell craters until the ground resembled a sea frozen in mid-tempest. These craters filled with water and mud, creating pools deep enough to drown in. And men did drown in them, wounded soldiers who slipped beneath the surface and could not climb out, exhausted soldiers who stumbled in the darkness and were sucked down by the clinging mire. The mud was everywhere, an omnipresent enemy almost as deadly as the shells. It fouled rifles and jammed machine guns. It made movement exhausting and resupply nearly impossible. Men lived in it, slept in it, died in it. And then there were the bodies. In the chaos of constant combat, the dead often could not be recovered. They lay where they had fallen, in trenches and shell holes, and on the open ground between the lines. As the weeks passed, they decomposed. The smell of death hung over the battlefield like a fog, so thick that soldiers sometimes vomited from the stench. New trenches were dug through old burial sites, unearthing corpses from earlier phases of the fighting. Men built parapets from sandbags and discovered arms or legs protruding from the earth. After a while, they stopped noticing. The presence of death became simply another feature of the landscape, as unremarkable as the mud or the constant noise of the guns. What kept men fighting in such conditions? The question haunted soldiers then and has haunted historians since. Part of the answer was simply discipline. The French army was a hierarchical organization with severe penalties for desertion or disobedience. Men went forward because they were ordered to go forward, and the consequences of refusal were dire. Part of the answer was comradeship. In the trenches, soldiers formed bonds of loyalty to the men beside them that transcended abstract causes like patriotism or national honor. They fought for each other because letting down their comrades was unthinkable. And part of the answer, frankly, was alcohol. The French army distributed wine and brandy to frontline troops with a generosity that would be remarkable in peacetime. Dulling the senses made the unbearable slightly more bearable. Captain Charles Delvert, a French officer who survived the battle, left a vivid description of what it felt like to be rotated into the front lines. Pétain had instituted a system designed to prevent any single unit from being destroyed by prolonged exposure to combat. Soldiers would spend 10 days in the frontline trenches, then 10 days in the support trenches behind them, then a period of rest in the rear before the cycle began again. In theory, this should have made the battle more sustainable. In practice, it simply meant that more men could experience the horror firsthand. "You feel like an animal being herded into the abattoir," Delvert wrote. The slaughterhouse. It was a comparison that many soldiers would have recognized. For the Germans, conditions were no better. They had launched this offensive expecting a quick victory that would bleed France dry. Instead, they found themselves trapped in the same nightmare as their enemies. A German soldier named Bernard Bing wrote home trying to describe what he was experiencing. "It is one big madhouse full of raving madmen," he said. The words captured something essential about Verdun. The battle had become divorced from reason, from strategy, from any normal calculus of military objectives. Both sides kept attacking, not because victory was in sight, but because they had forgotten how to stop. "We simply cannot stop," one of Bing's comrades observed. "We just carry on forward." The toll on mental health was devastating. Soldiers developed what doctors of the era called shell shock, a term that covered everything from temporary deafness to complete psychological breakdown. Men who had been perfectly healthy before the battle found themselves unable to stop shaking, unable to speak, unable to function at all. Some experienced vivid hallucinations or flashbacks that transported them back to the worst moments of combat. Others simply withdrew into themselves, staring blankly at nothing, unreachable by friends or family. The medical services were overwhelmed. There was no treatment available beyond rest and time, and often there was no time to spare. Men were patched up and sent back into the fighting as quickly as possible. Far from the front lines, the home fronts experienced the battle very differently. In Germany, the Allied naval blockade was beginning to bite hard. Food shortages that had been an inconvenience in 1915 became a crisis in 1916. Housewives queued for hours to buy bread that was increasingly adulterated with sawdust and potato flour. Meat became a luxury. Children went hungry. The winter of 1916 to 17 would later be called the turnip winter, because turnips were all that many Germans had to eat. The connection between the suffering at home and the suffering at Verdun was direct. Every shell fired, every gun manufactured, every soldier fed represented resources that could not go to the civilian population. Women who had seen their husbands and sons march off to war now struggled to hold their families together alone. A woman named Teresa von Wareham wrote to her husband at the front, trying to express her despair. "If anything happened to you," she said, "my life would be over. I feel so alone. Yet I cannot bear to be around anybody, not even the children." Her words captured the loneliness and fear that pervaded the German home front. Every knock at the door might bring a telegram announcing a death. Every day without news was a day of anxious waiting. The war that had begun with parades and patriotic songs had become a grinding misery that touched every household in the nation. In Germany, discontent began to spill into the streets. On May 1, 1916, a large crowd gathered in Berlin for what was officially a celebration of labor. But the mood was anything but celebratory. A far-left deputy named Karl Liebknecht mounted a platform and began to harangue the crowd. "Down with the government," he shouted. "Down with the war." It was an extraordinary moment of open dissent in a country where such speech could mean imprisonment or worse. And indeed, Liebknecht was arrested almost immediately, dragged off by police while the crowd watched in stunned silence. He would spend the rest of the war behind bars. But his words had been spoken. The cracks in German society were beginning to show. In France, the mood was different, but equally disconnected from the reality at the front. Paris, far from the guns, had returned to something resembling normal life. The initial panic of February had faded as the lines stabilized. Shops reopened, theaters and cafes filled with customers. Life went on, much as it always had, or so it seemed. Soldiers returning from Verdun on leave were struck by how little the capital seemed to understand what they had experienced. Captain Delbert wrote bitterly of his impressions. "Paris is delicious," he observed sarcastically. "You can see people back here are resigned to war. If you die out there on the barbed wire, you will not be that much of a loss." The gap between those who fought and those who remained safely at home would poison French society for a generation. By May, 60,000 French soldiers had already died at Verdun, 60,000 men, each with a name and a family and a life cut short. A man was dying every 2 minutes, around the clock, day after day, week after week. And yet the battle showed no signs of ending. Both sides were trapped in a logic of their own making. To stop fighting would be to admit that all those deaths had been in vain. To continue fighting meant adding to the toll. There seemed to be no way out except forward, through more blood and more suffering, until one side or the other finally collapsed. On May 22nd, the French attempted their first major counterattack. The objective was Fort Douaumont, the great fortress that had been lost so shamefully in February. Recapturing it would restore French honor and prove that the tide of battle was turning. At least, that was the theory. In practice, the assault was a disaster. French troops managed to reach the fort and even gained a foothold on its scarred surface. For a few hours, it seemed like success was within reach. Then the German artillery opened up. The counterattack was shattered. 5,000 French soldiers were killed, wounded, or captured in a matter of hours. They had achieved nothing. Douaumont remained in German hands. A soldier named Maurice Maréchal was among those who survived the failed assault. His account of the experience captures the madness of the battle in a few devastating sentences. "Douaumont has been taken, lost, retaken," he wrote. "The wounded are ghastly. One of them is crying, 'Mommy and my little girl.' It is madness. We are all mad." He was not exaggerating. The battle had unhinged something in the minds of everyone who experienced it. The normal rules that governed human behavior, the instinct for self-preservation, the distinction between the rational and the insane, all of it had been swept away by the enormity of the violence. June brought a new crisis. The Germans had been probing Fort Vaux for weeks, the second of the great fortresses after Douaumont. Unlike its larger neighbor, Vaux was fully garrisoned and prepared to resist. 400 French soldiers held the fort under the command of Major Sylvain Eugene Reynaud. They had limited water, limited ammunition, and no hope of relief. But they were determined to fight. For a week, they held out against continuous German assault, enduring 8,000 shells per day raining down on their position. The world watched and waited. On June 4th, the Germans finally breached the fort through a tunnel. What followed was close-quarters combat of medieval intensity. Men fought with bayonets and knives, with grenades and flamethrowers. "Kill these goddamn Frenchmen," a German lieutenant screamed as his soldiers pushed through the darkened corridors. The fighting was hand-to-hand, room to room, sometimes in complete darkness. Both sides knew the symbolic importance of this moment. Both sides fought with the desperation of men who believed everything depended on their actions. Eventually, the French garrison could fight no more. Their water had run out days before. They had been reduced to licking moisture from the walls of the fortress. When Major Raynal finally ordered the surrender, his men could barely stand. The Germans, who had fought so hard to kill them just hours earlier, now presented arms in respect. It was a gesture of soldiers, honor, and acknowledgement that their enemies had resisted beyond what could reasonably be expected. Raynal himself was treated as a hero by his captors. The Kaiser personally sent him a replacement sword after learning that his own had been taken as a trophy. Even in the midst of slaughter, there were moments of unexpected grace. The fall of Vaux opened the way to the next objective, Fort Souville, the last major fortification before Verdun itself. Beyond Souville lay the city and its cathedral, the ultimate prize. The Germans were closer to victory than they had ever been, yet they were also more exhausted than they had ever been. The men who had started the battle in February were dead or broken. Their replacements were younger and less experienced, thrown into the furnace with minimal training. The songs of victory that had echoed in the tunnels beneath Douaumont had long since faded. In their place was only the grim determination to survive another day. The meat grinder of Verdun consumed Germans and French alike, grinding them down with perfect impartiality. And still it continued, day after day, as spring turned to summer, and summer dragged on toward an uncertain autumn. The guns have long since fallen silent over Verdun. The hills that once trembled with explosions now stand quiet beneath forests that have slowly reclaimed the scarred earth. Wildflowers bloom in the shell craters. Birds sing where men once screamed. A century has passed since those 300 days of agony, and the world has changed in ways those soldiers could never have imagined. Yet the land remembers. Beneath the soil lie fragments of shells and bones that will never be recovered. The mingled remains of French and German boys who died believing their sacrifice meant something. The great ossuary at Douaumont holds the bones of 130,000 unidentified soldiers, enemies in life, united in death. Their story reminds us how fragile peace can be, how easily nations stumble into catastrophe, and how much courage ordinary people can summon when darkness falls. They shall not be forgotten.